The Overland Immigrants. The Overland Immigrants never cease to interest us. The illness, destitution, and suffering that obtained among these people has never been adequately depicted. For one outfit with healthy-looking members and adequate cattle, there were dozens conducted by hollow-eyed, gaunt men, drawn by few weak animals. Women trudged wearily, carrying children. And the tales they brought were terrible. They told us of thousands they had left behind in the great desert of the Humboldt Sink, fighting starvation, disease, and the loss of cattle. Women who had lost their husbands from the deadly cholera were staggering on without food or water, leading their children. The trail was lined with dead mules and cattle. Some said that 5,000 had perished on the plains from cholera alone. In the middle of the desert, miles from anywhere, were the death camps, the wagons drawn in the usual circle, the dead animals tainting the air, every living human being crippled from scurvy and other diseases. There was no fodder for the cattle, and one man told us that he estimated, soberly, that 3/4 of the draft animals on the plains must die. And then, where will their owners be? The Indians were hostile and thieving. Most of the ample provisions that had been laid in had to be thrown away to lighten the loads for the enfeebled animals. Such immigrants as got through often arrived in an impoverished condition. Many of these on the route were reduced by starvation to living on the putrefied flesh of the dead animals along the road. This occasioned more sickness. The desert seemed interminable. At nightfall, the struggling trains lay down exhausted with only the assurance of another scorching, burning day to follow. And when at last a few reached the Humboldt River, they found it almost impossible to ford, and the feed on the other side. In the distance showed the high, forbidding ramparts of the Sierra Nevadas. A man named Delano told us that 5 men drowned themselves in the Humboldt River in one day out of sheer discouragement. Another man said he had saved the lives of his oxen by giving some Indians $15 to swim the river and float some grass across to him. The water of the Humboldt had a bad effect on horses, and great numbers died. The Indians stole others. The animals that remained were weak. The destruction of property was immense, for everything that could be spared was thrown away in order to lighten the loads. The road was lined with abandoned wagons, stoves, mining implements, clothes. We were told these things over and over, heavily, in little snatches, by men too wearied and discouraged and beaten even to rejoice that they had come through alive. They were not interested in telling us what they told us, as though their minds were so full that they could not help it. I remember one evening when we were feeding at our camp the members of one of these trains, a charity every miner proffered nearly every day of the week. The party consisted of 1 wagon, a half-dozen gaunt, dull-eyed oxen, 2 men, and a crushed-looking, tragic young woman. One of the men had, in a crude way, the gift of words. He told of the crowds of people awaiting the new grass at Independence in Missouri, of making up of the parties, the election of the officers for the trip, the discussion of routes, the visiting, the campfires, the boundless hope. There were nearly 20,000 people waiting for the grass, said our friend, a statement we thought exaggerated, but one which I have subsequently found to be not far from the truth. By the middle of May, the trail from the Missouri River to Fort Laramie was occupied by a continuous line of wagons. That was fine traveling, said the immigrant, in the detached way of one who speaks of dead history. There was grass and water, and the wagons seemed like a little house at night. Everybody was jolly. It didn't last long. After Fort Laramie, there were 300 miles of plains with little grass and less water. We thought that was a desert, exclaimed the immigrant bitterly. My God! Quite a lot turned back at Laramie. They were scared by the cholera that broke out, scared by the stories of the desert, scared by the Indians. They went back. I suppose they're well and hearty, and kicking themselves every gold report that goes back east. The bright anticipations, the joy of life, the romance of the journey all faded before the grim reality. The monotony of the plains, the barrenness of the desert, the toil of the mountains, the terrible heat, the dust, the rains, the sickness, the tragedy of deaths had flattened all buoyancy and left in its stead only a sullen, dogged determination. There was lots of quarreling, of course, said our narrator. Everybody was on edge. There were fights that we had to settle somehow, and bad feeling. They had several minor skirmishes with Indians, lost from their party by disease, suffered considerable hardships and infinite toil. We thought we had had a hard time, said our friend wonderingly. Lord. At the very start of the journey, they had begun to realize that they were overloaded and had commenced to throw away superfluous goods. Several units of the party had even to abandon some of their wagons. We chucked everything we thought we could get along without. I know we spent all one day frying out bacon to get the grease before we threw it away. We used the grease for our axles. They reached the head of the Humboldt. Up to this point, they had kept together, but now demoralization began. They had been told at Salt Lake City that they had but 400 miles to go to Sacramento. Now they had discovered that at the Humboldt, they still had more than that distance to travel, and that before them lay the worst desert of all. Mind you, said our friend, we had been traveling desperately. Our cattle had died one by one. We had doubled up with our teams. We had starved for water until our beasts were ready to drop, and our own tongues had swollen in our mouths. And we're scared, I tell you, scared. He moistened his lips slowly and went on. Sometimes we took 2 or 3 hours to go a mile, relaying back and forth. We were down to a fine point. It wasn't a question of keeping our property anymore. It was a case of saving our lives. We had abandoned a good half of our wagons already. When we got to the Humboldt and learned from a mountain man going the other way that the great desert was still before us, and when we had made a day or two's journey down the river toward the sink, I tell you, we lost our nerve and our sense. He ruminated a few moments in silence. My God, man, he cried, that trail. From about halfway down the river, the carcasses of horses and oxen were so thick that I believe if they had been laid in the road instead of alongside, you could have walked the whole way without setting foot to ground. And then the river disappeared underground, and they had to face the crossing of the sink itself. That was a real desert, the immigrant told us somberly. There were long white fields of alkali and drifts of ashes across them, so soft that the cattle sank way to their bellies. They moaned and bellowed. Lord, how they moaned. And the dust rose up so thick that you couldn't breathe. And the sun beat down so fierce you felt like something heavy on your head. And how the place stunk with dead beasts. The party's organization broke. The march became a rout. Everybody pushed on with what strength they had. No man, woman, or child could ride. The wagons were emptied of everything but the barest necessities. At every stop some animal fell in the traces and was cut out of the yoke. When a wagon came to a stop, it was abandoned. The animals detached and driven forward. Those who were still afoot were constantly besought by those who had been forced to a standstill. I saw one old man, his wife, and his daughter, all walking along on foot, said the immigrant bitterly. They were half knee-deep in alkali. The sun was broiling hot. They had absolutely nothing. We couldn't help them. What earthly chance had they? I saw a wagon stalled, the animals lying dead in their yokes, all except one old ox. A woman and 3 children sat inside the wagon. She called to me that they hadn't had anything to eat for 3 days and begged me to take the children. I couldn't. I could have stopped and died there with her, but I couldn't put another pound on my wagon and hope to get through. We were all walking alongside, even Sue here. The woman raised her tragic face. We left our baby there," she said, and stared back again into the coals of the fire. "We made it," resumed the immigrant. "We got to the Truckee River somehow, and we rested there 3 days. I don't know what became of the rest of our train, dead perhaps." We told him of the immigrant register or bulletin board at Morton's. "I must look that over," said he. "I don't know how long it took us to cross the mountains. Those roads are terrible, and our cattle were weak. We were pretty near out of grub, too. Most of the people have no food at all. Well, here we are, but there are thousands back of us. What are they going to do? And when the mountains fill with snow?" After the trio, well fed for the first time in months, had turned in, we sat talking about our fire. We were considerably subdued and sobered, for this was the first coherent account we had heard at first hand. 2 things impressed us: the tragedy, the futility. The former aspect hit us all. The latter struck strongly at Old and Cal. Those youngsters, wise in the ways of the plains, were filled with sad surprise over the incompetence of it all. "But there ain't no manner of use in it," cried Old. "They are just bulling at it plumb regardless. They ain't handled their cattle right. They ain't picked their route right. Why, the old Mormon trail down by the Carson Sink is better than that death trap across the Humboldt. And cut-offs, what license they all got, chasing every fool cut-off reported in. Most of 'em is all right for pack trains and all wrong for wagons. Oh, Lord!" "They don't know," said I. "Poor devils, they don't know. They were raised on farms and in the cities." Johnny had said nothing. His handsome face looked very somber in the firelight. "Jim," he said, "we're due for a trip tonight, but I want you to promise me one thing. Just keep these people here and feed them up until we get back. Tell them I've got a job for them. Will you do it?" I tried to pump Johnny as to his intentions, but could get nothing out of him, and so promised blindly. About 2 o'clock I was roused from my sleep by a soft moving about. Thrusting my head from the tent, I made out the dim figures of our horsemen, mounted and moving quietly away down the trail.